Your Royal Highness, members of the Prince Mahidol Award Foundation, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the Prince Mahidol Award Foundation for making the award, which I'm honored and delighted to receive, and for giving me the opportunity to address this conference. More than 30 years ago, I started working on technologies for making antibody pharmaceuticals. The field has now come of age. Antibody pharmaceuticals are transforming the practice of medicine and have escaped from academia to take the pharmaceutical industry. 30 years ago, there was a single monoclonal antibody approved as a therapeutic drug. There are now more than 35 approvals, with many others in late-stage clinical trials. Antibodies have become some of the best-selling medicines. In 2015, the pharmaceutical charts of world drug sales were topped by the antibody adalimumab, marketed as Humira. This antibody alone had sales of more than $15 billion per year, and together with similar antibodies, has transformed the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. Although the use of monoclonal antibodies as pharmaceutical drugs is recent, antibodies date back to man's origins and are found in mammals and birds. Antibodies are produced naturally by the immune system in response to foreign proteins and help protect against infectious agents such as bacteria and viruses. Antibodies can stay in the blood for months. They're big enough to escape filtration through the kidneys, and they have recycling mechanisms to escape digestion by the cells lining the blood vessels. In many senses, antibodies are nature's own pharmaceuticals. However, compared to traditional chemical drugs, antibodies are huge protein molecules. The antibody immunoglobulin G molecule has a molecular mass of 150,000 Daltons compared to 500 Daltons for a typical chemical drug. Generally, antibodies have a Y shape, as shown on the slide, with two arms and a stem, which is represented on the slide by a trace of the polypeptide backbone. Like a Swiss army knife, the antibody is a multifunctional tool. The tips of the antibody arms bind to the virus or bacterium. This alone can be enough to prevent it adhering to or infecting a cell. The antibody stem can act as a flag to the immune system and trigger the release from immune cells of a stream of reactive and damaging chemicals such as peroxides or superoxides, or proteins that punch holes in bacterial membranes. Alternatively, the stem can help phagocytes attach to and engulf the pathogen. Although in nature, antibodies have evolved to attack infectious agents and toxins, we've learned in the last 30 years to direct them against non-infectious diseases such as cancer and immune disorders. This includes cancers of the breast, bowel, head and neck, bone and blood, immune disorders ranging from transplantation rejection, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoporosis, Crohn's disease, psoriasis, ankylosing spondylitis, asthma, multiple sclerosis, and acute macular degeneration. Antibodies have transformed the treatment of these diseases. Antibodies can be extremely potent. This next slide shows the action of a modern pharmaceutical antibody, alemtuzumab, marketed as Lemtrada, directed against human B and T cells. This was the first antibody pharmaceutical made and was the first ever used in patients. This patient had a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma with an accumulation of white cells in the spleen. Over the 30 days of treatment, a great mass of tumor, that's several kilograms, was destroyed, leading to clinical remission. Other pharmaceutical antibodies have been used to kill cells in a similar manner, such as trastuzumab, marketed as Herceptin, for treatment of breast cancer, and cetuximab, marketed as Erbitux, for treatment of bowel cancer. It's not always necessary for the antibody to kill cells in order to have a therapeutic action. For example, the antibody adalimumab, Humira, mentioned earlier, works by blocking the action of TNF, a mediator of inflammation. The antibody bevacizumab, marketed as Avastin, works by blocking the action of a growth factor that stimulates the formation of new blood vessels around a tumor, and in this way starves a tumor of the nutrients it needs to survive. The application of antibodies to treat non-infectious human diseases is very recent and required the development of novel technologies. It was a particular challenge to make human antibodies against human disease proteins. Although the immune system readily makes antibodies against foreign proteins, it's blocked from making antibodies against self-proteins, such as those involved in cancer. During the last 30 years, we developed several possible solutions to this conundrum. The approach that I adopted was to make humanized antibodies. And this is shown in this next slide. So starting off with a mouse antibody on the left, which we obtained by first immunizing mice with human proteins. This antibody was then transformed into its human counterpart by the alchemy of genetic engineering. In essence, mice are first immunized with the human proteins, and the mouse antibody is raised, and then we go through this act of genetic transformation. So in the slide you can see we take the tips of the antibody arms from the mouse antibody, and we stitch these into a human antibody and use this humanized antibody as a lead for the development of antibody drugs. These antibodies do not seem to be recognized as foreign by the immune system. The good news is that this and other technologies have been used to create a wealth of new antibody drugs, and new applications are discovered every year. Recently, there have been spectacular results with antibodies such as the humanized antibody pembrolizumab, marketed as Keytruda, that help T cells recognize and kill melanomas and other tumors. There are already hundreds of clinical trials of these so-called immune checkpoint inhibitors in progress. Finally, I was asked to direct some remarks to healthcare provision. Unfortunately, antibody drugs are incredibly expensive, typically in the region of $30,000 to $100,000 per year for treatment of cancer, but they can be up to $400,000 a year for treatment of rare diseases, in particular paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, or PNH. Clearly, prices of the drugs will have to come down. The biggest driver of high prices is the need to recoup the costs and risks of drug development and marketing. These costs are huge. The development of a pharmaceutical can typically run into billions of dollars before it receives marketing approval. The costs are accelerating, including the costs of failures, and using inflation-adjusted dollars. In 1979, it took the pharmaceutical industry $100 million to develop a new drug. By 2015, this figure had risen to $3.8 billion. Not only is the scale of these costs driving up the prices of drugs, but choking off the development of new drugs. This is a challenge that needs to be tackled, and we may need to change the entire model for drug development and marketing. This, I think, will be even more difficult than the research and the clinical work so far in developing these antibodies. And I wish good fortune to all of you who are tackling these problems. Although I doubt we'll ever reach equality of healthcare provision, I think we could do much better. Thank you.